Please join me in welcoming John Duncan.
When Dave approached me a few months back about giving this talk, I said, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, you can talk about what you think a general educated audience should know about pre-modern Korea. He says, won't that be fun? I thought about it and I said, yeah, sounds like it would be a lot of fun. Then I sat down and really started thinking about it and realized I had been given a very tall order. I spent over 40 years studying Korea. And so I'm sitting there saying, what do I choose to talk about? What do I ignore? What do I include? How do I reduce all of this into 35 or 40 minutes? And so I agonized quite a bit before coming up with a list of themes or topics that I would like to touch on today. And what I will do before I get into those themes, first is try to deconstruct 2 or 3 widely believed myths about Korean history. And then I will go into what I think are some of the most salient and often underappreciated aspects of pre-modern Korea. One will be Korea's very long history as a unified polity. A second will be what I think, at least, is the very sophisticated system of centralized bureaucratic rule that developed in Korea in pre-modern times. Then I will turn to a brief discussion of pre-modern Korean identities. How do these people see themselves? Then I will talk a bit about Korean contributions to East Asian civilization, and I suppose by extension, world civilization. And I will conclude with some speculative thoughts about how the pre-modern Korean experience still informs Korean society today. So let's talk about the myths. Yeah, it's not at all uncommon to hear people in Korea talk about 5,000 years of history, 5,000년의 역사, or 반만년의 역사, the history of a half a millennium. Not a millennium, what is it, half of 10,000 years? I'm sorry, nobody has 5,000 years of history, not the Egyptians, not the Chinese, nobody. And we historians look at Korea. We say, well, Korea starts appearing in Chinese texts sometime around 500 or 600 before current era. So we could call that sort of proto-history. We really don't see Korea as being fully historical until around the 1st century before current era, or the 1st century of the Common Era. So where does this come from? Why do people say 5,000 years of history? Well, there are a couple things. One is this. This is Tangun Harawaji, the mythological founder of the first Korean state. And the myth tells us that his father came down from heaven and married a bear woman and had a child who's known to us as Tangun, and Tangun established the first state in Korea, Tangun Choson, or Old Choson. This happened 2,333 before the Common Era. Well, that's not 5,000 years. We're looking at about 4,347 years or something like that. So we're still a few hundred years shy. I suppose it's close enough, right? This particular statue is one that you can see commonly in South Korea. I've even seen it in Sedona, Arizona, believe it or not. Yeah. Blew me away when I saw that. But here is, oops, went the wrong way. Yeah. Here is Tangun's tomb. About 15 years ago, my colleagues in North Korea astounded the world when they announced that they had discovered the tomb of Mr. and Mrs. Tangun. And they reported that Tangun was about 7 feet tall and all of these wonderful things. And so then they proceeded to build this monument at the tomb site of Tangun. And the North Koreans say that we are all the descendants of Tangun. This makes Korea the oldest country in the world. Okay, fine. But myths are myths, right? But you have serious scholars who talk about 5,000 years of Korean history. But where does this come from? I think this comes from certain assumptions about the Neolithic peoples who lived in Korea 3,000 years ago. Scholars believe that they can trace cultural continuity from Neolithic times down to today. And scholars also assume that those Neolithic peoples who lived in Korea 5,000 years ago are the direct ancestors of today's Korean people. So I guess that's where they come off with 5,000 years of history. I might accept 5,000 years of cultural continuity, but as an historian, I have trouble with 5,000 years of history. A second myth that I'd like to talk about is the myth of racial purity or ethnic purity. There's a Korean term, Tanil Minjok, which I have roughly translated below as meaning a unitary ethnic nation, ethno-nation. Basically, the argument has been, up until quite recently, that Koreans had pure bloodlines. Or a more nuanced scholar might say, nobody has pure bloodlines, but we Koreans have had less interracial mixing than any other people in the world. And so therefore we are a unitary ethnic nation. Lots of problems with that. We can find any number of instances of people from places like China, Mongolia, Central Asia, Japan, and elsewhere. So we can find all sorts of evidence that these other people came in, settled in Korea, intermarried with Koreans, and became part of the Korean nation today. Where did this come from? Actually, the idea that Koreans constitute a pure nation, a pure race, was probably propagated for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century by some founders of a new religion in Korea called Taejongyo, who argued that Tangun was the original ancestor of all Koreans. Problematic argument to make, because if you look at the Tangun myth, you will see that the myth says that there were already people on the earth when Tangun's father arrived and when he married the bear woman. So who were those people then? I guess they were not Koreans. They were all wiped out by Tangun's descendants. A third myth that I'd like to talk about is the idea of that Korean history is a story of incessant invasions by foreigners. It's a history of suffering inflicted by outsiders. The Korean term for this is sunane yoksa. And basically they say Korean history is a long, sad story of constant invasions by foreigners, by outsiders. To be sure, the last 150 years of Korean history have seen a lot of misery inflicted by outsiders. Imperial competition over Korea in the late 19th century, colonization by Japan, division of the country by the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945, Korean War that broke out in 1950, ended up with US and Chinese forces wreaking havoc on much of the peninsula. So the past 150 years, I'd say yes. You can characterize Korean history like that. If you go back to earlier Korean history, it becomes much more problematic. Oops. Here we have some 20th century, 21st century depictions of foreigners invading Korea. The one on your left, I think, is a painting valorizing Korean peasants resisting Mongol invaders in the 13th century. And the one on your right is a modern reenactment of Japanese invaders of the late 19th century slaughtering poor innocent Koreans. We get a lot of that. But the real truth is that Korean history is also characterized by very long periods without any invasions from outside. You can go from the second half of the 7th century to the end of the 10th century, a period of a little over 3 centuries, no outside invasions. You can go from the early 11th century through the mid 13th century. You've got over 200 years without invasions. You go the 15th and 16th centuries, no invasions. And you go the second half of the 17th century through the mid 19th century, no invasions. 200- and 300-year periods when Korea was not invaded from the outside. I would say that's a rather exceptional case in human history. Maybe Japan, surrounded, protected by its waters, but certainly not China. And certainly not countries like Poland, for heaven's sakes, which is here one day, there the next day, and gone the next, thanks to its Russian and German neighbors. Rather, I would say that it was during these long periods of peace that Koreans really began to develop a sophisticated variant of East Asian civilization in the peninsula. So I'm going to switch over to my main themes now. And the first thing I want to talk about is Korea's long history as a unified polity. Let's see if I can get this to go the right direction this time. Yeah. There I have for you a chart showing the major Korean kingdoms. We have the 3 kingdoms, or some people even like to claim the 4 kingdoms, which occupied the Korean peninsula and adjacent areas up until the middle of the 7th century. Then we have what is usually referred to in South Korea as unified Silla, from 668 until the early 10th century. Although the North Koreans would dispute that and say, what do you mean unified? Silla didn't unify the peninsula. Look at all the territory that was left outside of Shilla's control. Silla didn't unify Korea. The nation was first unified instead by Goryeo in the early 10th century. And that's a position that is also beginning to be taken with increasing frequency by scholars in South Korea as well. They're becoming more and more reluctant to talk about unified Silla, and they will talk about later Silla, and then they will add in Parhae, or Chinese Bohai, up to the north. And they will say that Korea was first unified by the Goryeo dynasty in the year 936. But even if we accept this later date, 936, that means that Korea was unified politically from 936 until Korea was colonized by Japan in 1910. That's almost 1,000 years of continued unity, first under the Goryeo dynasty and then from 1392 under the Choson dynasty. The point here, I guess, that I want to make is that all of you who have grown up knowing just a divided Korea, North Korea, South Korea, that type of division is an historical aberration. It's not the norm for Korea. And we'll return to this question of division at the end of the talk today. A second thing I would like to talk a bit about is pre-modern Korea's really quite sophisticated centralized bureaucratic system. Here in the West, we talk about the rise of the modern state. We say it began in places like France and England with these absolutist kingdoms. France and King Louis the Latissima, this kind of stuff in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. They say that truly modern states first appeared in the 19th century. And the modern states had the following features. They were centralized, they were bureaucratic, they were meritocratic, and they were able to penetrate efficiently all of their territories. So this is something new. We hadn't had this in human history before. The Eurocentric view will tell you. Yeah. Then we come to East Asia. Things get a little more complicated. Sorry, guys. Silla, Goryeo, and Choson all had elaborate centralized bureaucracies. Each had a somewhat different system, but they were all quite complex. And they were all based, to greater or lesser degrees, on Chinese models of centralized bureaucratic rule. The essential features of the central government are that you had a king who presided and, in theory, if not in reality, exercised absolute power. Underneath the kings were councils for formulating policy. And then there were numerous executive ministries, sort of the equivalent to the United States departments, Department of the Treasury, for example. They had ministries for personnel, war, revenue, rights, those kinds of things. And then the central governments had scores of lesser agencies charged with specific tasks, whether it's maintaining the royal stable or providing the palace with pottery or whatever. So they really were quite complex entities. What you see here is a building that still exists today in Gyeongbok Palace in downtown Seoul. That's the building where the king held court. The building is called Gyeongbwan, which I suppose can be translated something like, what did I put up there? The Hall of Diligent Governance. That's where the king met with his high-ranking officials. So that was the central government. What about the system of local government? Except for the courtial period, which is a little different. The countryside was controlled directly by the center. You had provinces headed by governors. You had prefectures and counties that were headed by magistrates. And these governors and magistrates were not elected locally. They were all appointed by the central government. I think I have a couple of slides here. Oops, wrong direction, right direction. Here, for example, are the 8 provinces of the Choson dynasty. And here is a Choson era map showing the prefectures in Kyonggi province, the province that's right around the capital city. So with this kind of structure of hierarchical structure of government with provinces, prefectures, and counties, the pre-modern Korean state was often quite capable of penetrating its territories. In the Choson period, for example, the state carried out land surveys where it recorded land ownership, recorded the fertility of the land, and all of that was for purposes of collecting taxes. It also compiled household registers for each prefecture or county. This is an example from an area called Tansong down in southeastern Korea. And on these household registers, they recorded the number of people who lived in the house. They recorded their gender, whether they were male or female, and they recorded their age. And again, this was for taxation purposes. At times, the Choson government was able to force the relocation of thousands of what the histories describe as affluent households from relatively affluent districts in the southern part of Korea up to the northern part of Korea, which the state felt was too sparsely populated. So it seems like the Choson state, at least at times, had a great deal of ability to control its populace. But Choson is not the only case. What I have here for you now is a copy of a Silla village document, which is believed to have dated to the 8th century. It was discovered quite by accident in Japan in the early years of the 20th century. And it records data for several villages in West Central Korea. Just to give you one example, one of these villages, this is the kind of information I had. The village name is Sahejam. It occupies a territory of flat land and some hills. The area of Sahejam is measured by a circumference of 5,725 paces. Sahejam has 11 households containing 145 people. And all of these people are enumerated according to gender, age, and social status. Then it goes on to tell us that Sahejam had 25 horses and 22 cattle. It had 102 kyul. A kyul is a measure roughly about 2 acres of rice paddies, 62 kyul of dry fields, 1,004 mulberry trees, 120 pine nut trees, and 112 walnut trees. Why was all of this information being recorded? So the government could collect taxes and mobilize the people for labor services. And this, we're talking about the 8th century. So Koreans have had a long experience with a strong and intrusive central government. What about the question of meritocracy? Those of you who have studied Korea realize that Korea has a long aristocratic tradition. I won't deny that for a minute. But Korea also has a very long tradition of selecting the officials to serve in its government through a civil service examination, or more broadly through government service examinations, which included civil service, military service, and various technical fields. This system was implemented in the middle of the 10th century, the year 958 in the Goryeo dynasty, and it lasted all the way until the end of the 19th century. And as time passed, it became more and more important to people who wanted to seek office. And seeking office was the highest goal in pre-modern Korea. So I would say the principle of meritocracy, albeit perhaps within only a socially qualified group, was well established in Korea long before Western scholars start talking about meritocracy in the modern European state. Okay, so far so good? All right. Let's talk a little bit about identities now. This is a topic that gets me a little exercise sometimes. We've had in the past 25 or 30 years a great deal of scholarship here in the West, represented by people like Ernst Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and others, that nations, nationalisms, national identities are a modern phenomenon. It came into being at the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century in the West, and then spread throughout the rest of the world. And that national identity, nationalism in places like East Asia are simply sort of defensive measures. Let it rest for a minute. Okay, are we back? They were defensive measures or derivative discourses in which local people in countries like India or Korea or China borrowed notions of nation and nationalism from the West in order to strengthen themselves against Western aggression. Okay, sure. If you're going to talk about France, I'll buy that. Don't know enough about India to pass judgment there. When it comes to China and Korea and perhaps to Japan, I become very skeptical. We have a lot of evidence that suggests that at least the elites of pre-modern Korea had a strong sense of what we might call a Korean identity. Of course, these elites also saw themselves as participants in a universal cultural order, represented by Confucianism. But at the same time, these Korean elites also said, we are Korean. Forgot to show you this, sorry. That's a reenactment of the civil service examination in the Choson period. But anyway, I keep going the wrong direction. Yes, that's right. Okay. We can find this evidence in a number of places, particularly in histories. The oldest surviving histories from Korea date back to the 12th century. And these histories are already what we could call national histories. The 12th century is a Goryeo period. Before the Goryeo period, there was this period of later Silla. Before that, there were the three kingdoms. Before that, there's this sort of legendary, mythological old Choson. But these histories, they trace a genealogy of Korean states. So Goryeo came from later Silla. Later Silla came out of the three kingdoms. The three kingdoms came out of old Choson. And They adopt terminology for Korea, such as Dongguk, or Eastern Kingdom, in opposition to Chungguk, or Central Kingdom for China, or terms like Samhan, which could be seen as a kind of ethnic designation, to distinguish themselves. Say, we are Dongguk, we are not Chungguk. We're Korea, we're not China. We belong to this collectivity that transcends individual kingdoms or dynasties, that shares a history, a language, and a culture. The founding king of the Koryo dynasty is reported to have said in some injunctions that he left behind for his successors that we here in this eastern country, Dongguk, we have long admired and respected the institutions of Tang China, and we have modeled many of our institutions after them. But our country, our land, and our people are different from those of China. And there is no reason why we should go out of our way to imitate everything from China. Then we have a 15th century scholar official named Yang Sungji, who I think expressed it very concisely. He wrote, from the very beginning of time, of historical time, in China there have been 27 dynasties. In Korea, or Dongguk, as he put it, there have only been 7 dynasties. Why is this so? It's not simply because of cultural differences between the Chinese and us. It's also because we here in the Eastern Kingdom have these great families who are spread throughout the country and who have blocked treacherous elements. So he's making very clear distinctions between Korea and China in many different ways: cultural differences, historical differences, social differences. And he's clearly expressing the idea that he belongs to a collectivity that is distinctly Korean and has very old historical roots. What were the commoners thinking? I have no idea. Kim Gapdori, Joe Kim, was not leaving us diaries in which he confided into us, I'm a Korean. We just don't have that evidence. I wish we did. When I first started studying about East Asia and Korea back long time ago, back in the late 1960s, the textbooks that I read basically said everything in East Asia came from China. Taoism, Confucianism, pottery, painting, the writing system, you name it, it all came from China and spread out from China to China's neighbors like Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. Of course, there was Buddhism, which originally came from India, but it came to China first, and after about 2 or 3 centuries of gestation in China, then it spread out from China to the China's neighbors. Okay, sounds good to me, I thought. But then as I began studying Korean history in more detail, I began to become a little bit skeptical of this notion that everything came from China. I'll give you a couple of simple examples. One is the question of the origins of Chan Buddhism. Chan is called Zen in Japanese, San in Korean. Chan Buddhism is believed to have originated in China, and in the words of one of the early and very eminent scholars of Chan or Zen Buddhism, it arose as a uniquely Chinese response to abstract Indian metaphysical thought. Simply, it was an expression of the structure of Chinese society and of the Chinese national character. It could have only arisen in China. And from there it spread to Korea and Japan. Okay, what do I know? He's a big name. One of my colleagues at UCLA, a guy who has a great deal of deep knowledge, both Chinese and Korean Buddhism, published a book, I don't know, gosh, it must be almost 20 years ago now, in which he demonstrated that one of the seminal texts of Chan Buddhism, one that was always attributed to Chinese authors, actually was first written in Korea and then taken to China. And this text had in it a number of key concepts for the development of Chan Buddhism, one of which was that the Buddha nature resides in everybody, and thus the Buddha nature is subject to awakening if approached properly. This particular text, the one that is of most importance, is something called Kyongsang Sammegyangnon, or Wan Hyo's commentary on the Sutra Adamantine Absorption. So he has concluded that, in fact, it was feedback from Silla that played a very important role in the formation of the Chan school of Buddhism in China. And this sort of turned the existing interpretations upside down. I can give a number of other examples. I keep forgetting to do this. There's the commentary that I just talked about. One of the things that I can point to is printing. Of course, Chinese were the first ones to develop printing in East Asia. Started off with woodblock printing, and the Koreans, well, certainly by the Three Kingdoms, were also engaged in their own woodblock printing in imitation of the Chinese. But what I particularly want to talk about here is movable metal type. We've all learned that it was the great Gutenberg in Germany in the mid-15th century who first came up with movable metal type. Again, East Asia complicates the picture, doesn't it? In the 11th century, the Chinese were developing movable type. They experimented with wooden movable type, decided they didn't like the results, and so then they moved on to ceramic movable type. Well, this notion of movable type apparently made its way to Koryo. The people in Koryo experimented with ceramic type. It didn't work out very well for them for complicated reasons. And so they said, let's do it with metal. And so in 1234, people in Koryo printed the first book in human history that was done with movable metal type. It was a book called the Sangjang Yemun, kind of examination of ritual texts. What I have up here for you is a printing block, printing plate, not block, for the oldest surviving book that was produced using movable metal print, and that was the Chikchi, which dates back to the year 1377 in Koryo. So the point here is that, yeah, a lot of good stuff came out of China. But not everything came out of China. There was feedback. So we need to grasp the flows and counterflows of culture in East Asia and Korea's contributions to that. And this is important not only for more correct understanding of pre-modern East Asia, but also what's going on right now. Even though we all were sort of mesmerized by China's size and its rapidly growing economy, anybody who pays a whole lot of attention to contemporary East Asia will realize that Korea is a very important player. Okay. Now, let's come to pre-modern Korea and Korea today. Confucianism. Everybody wants to know about Confucianism. Everybody says South Korea is the most Confucian country in the world. South Korea is the one country that has preserved the Confucian tradition for the modern world. I hear not only from Westerners, but I hear that from Koreans and from Asians. People come from China and from Taiwan and other places to Korea to study Confucianism because it has been lost in their countries. Yeah, okay. In some ways, that's probably true. There's a lot of very serious scholarship that has been done in Confucian thought and Confucian philosophy in 20th century Korea. I was blessed to be able to study among one of the greatest of those philosophers during my years at Korea University. I learned a great deal from that man. And of course, Confucian ritual has been preserved in Korea in certain ways. What you see here is the enactment of a ritual honoring Confucius at Sönggyun'gwan, a university in Seoul that is located on the site of the old Royal Confucian College of the Choson dynasty. And they do these kind of rituals on a regular basis, just as they had done them in the Choson period. And even at home, people routinely carry out what is known in Korea as the Chesa, or I suppose the ancestor memorial ceremony, on appropriate days throughout the year. So you can find this stuff. You can find people still very diligently studying Confucian philosophy. You can find people still carrying out Confucian rituals. And people also have liked to point to the preservation of certain key Confucian social values in Korean society. For example, filial piety, the idea that the son should serve his father. Or Kyonggi, the idea that people should respect their elders. Those were still quite prevalent when I was a student in Korea, the early 1970s. They're fading rapidly now. They're on their way out, I'm sorry to say. Social change has made them unattractive and impractical. Other people also look at certain characteristics of Korean society and say it's a very androcentric, very patriarchal society. It's very hierarchical. It's very authoritative. So all of these are Confucian attributes. Okay, sure. But patriarchy, hierarchy, authority are hardly unique to Korea or to Confucian societies. I think about what life was like for my grandmother in northern Arizona in the early 20th century. It was very patriarchal, very hierarchical, very authoritative system that she grew up under. Was that Confucian? Rather, I think what you have in the case of Korea is that conservative elements in Korean society really like to fall back on the tradition of Confucianism in order to oppose fundamental social changes. Whereas progressive elements, on the other hand, spend a great deal of time attacking Confucianism for the way in which it oppresses women and reinforces class boundaries, these kinds of things. Okay, it's useful for polemical purposes, I guess. But I would be very careful before I attributed features of contemporary Korean society to Confucian tradition. I think it's much more complex than that. Another issue is the way in which historical narratives are used to construct modern Korean identities. Things like this long history of suffering. You know, we Koreans got to stick together because these bad guys outside are always picking on us. So they talk about this long history of suffering. And they talk about resistance to outside aggression. And they give us our heroes. Ulchimundok. Any of you ever heard of Ulchimundok? He's this Kogoryu general who is recorded in the histories as having lured invaders from Sui China into an ambush. And of an army of 300,000 Chinese, only 3,000 are supposedly escaped alive. Those numbers are always suspect, right? But Ulchimundok. Park Chung-hee erected a statue of Ulchimundok over in the eastern part of Seoul, which you see there on your left-hand side. And if you're familiar with downtown Seoul, you know that one of the main streets is Ulchiro. If you pay any attention to what the South Korean and the military and the U.S. military do, you realize they carry out military training exercises under the name of Ulchimundok every year. So Ulchimundok has become quite a hero. The interesting thing is if you go back to the earlier histories, you read stuff, say, from the Koryo period and the Choson period, they talk about Ulchimundok. They don't talk about him as this great general who killed all these Chinese. They talk about him as a great poet. He didn't become a military hero until the 20th century. And the other one, Yi Sun-shen. I'm sure all of you have heard of the great Admiral Yi Sun-shen. He was a hero, no doubt about it. And there was some memory of him kept alive during the Choson period. But again, it was in the 1960s and 1970s. This particular statue, which dominates downtown Seoul, was erected, I think, in the early 1970s, again by Park Chung-hee. So you have nationalists and politicians and scholars in the 20th century going back to these historical memories, or reconstructing historical memories in order to create what they think would be desirable modern contemporary Korean identity. In the 20th century study of Korean history, one of the biggest issues, particularly over the last 50 or 60 years, is whether or not Korea was stagnant, historically stagnant, or whether it was progressing. And from the 1960s on in South Korea, the dominant narrative has been something we call the internal development theory, which says that Korea was following the same general path of progressive historical development as England and other Western European countries. A lot of that has to do with just refuting what Japan's colonial masters had said about Korea being a stagnant, unchanging traditional order during the colonial period. But it's also important because in certain ways it connects pre-modern Korea to modern Korea. It creates this continuity for us between pre-modern and modern Korea. It says Korea had been an advanced country in the past. So there's no reason why Korea shouldn't be an advanced country now. And the internal development theory also depicts for us the early formation of a nation in Korea, a nation that has survived to the current day. So we have this great tradition. And the kind of memories that are fostered by historians, politicians, and nationalist propagandizers and others may be, in some ways, the most important motivation Koreans have for attaining reunification. These memories of long national unity. Here's a rather typical sort of representation of Korean sentiment, or at least some Koreans. It says, 우리는 하나입니다. We are one. People of North Korea, the people of South Korea are one. So they, yeah, there's real motivation for unification. There's a real passion for unification. There is, maybe in my generation, maybe in the generation immediately after me. These days, I'm not so sure. Here are a couple of recent depictions, images of reunification produced by school children in South Korea. The one on your left looks kind of hopeful, right? There's the Mugunghwa, the national flower of Korea, in there between North and South. The implication is that we can do this. We can have reunification. The other one is a little more interesting to me. The jacket shows the North Korean side, flag on the one side, South Korean flag on the other. You've got a zipper in between. The zipper is partly open. Is it going down or is it going up? What does it mean if it goes down? If it goes down, does that mean that it's permanent division? If it comes up, does that mean unification? Or is it the other way around? I'm not sure. It's very ambiguous. And I think this probably expresses the mindset of a lot of members of the younger generation in Korea today. Can we have reunification? Will it happen? And is it desirable? I don't know. For the younger generation, I can't speak for them. I can only speak for my generation and say that for us, reunification is a really important issue. And those desires for reunification are based in understandings of pre-modern Korean history. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your very illuminating talk. My question is, at the beginning of the talk, you talk about one of the myths is in understanding Korean history being Korea as being suffered from outside invasion constantly throughout the history. Mm-hmm. But you said that that's not the case because Korea actually enjoyed a pretty long peaceful periods in between those invasions. So why do you think do people have, does conventional wisdom hold that Korea as like has experienced tsunade 역사, like a suffering history?
I think that's a product of the nationalist discourse of the early 20th century. It's a call to unity. They're saying, you know, we have to have 민족의 대단결, great national unity, in order to resist these foreign aggressors. And we've had a long history of people invading, attacking Korea, and we have successfully beat them back, and we can do so again. So I think it's all very much part of the nationalist discourse on Korea's history and on the need for unity.
So I'm interested in, I thought it was really interesting, this use of the images, like ulchi, you know. So here's one that obviously we're talking a lot about now, which is dokdo, right? And I wonder what you know, I can promise if you want, we can make sure this isn't on the web, so right, we won't put it. But I'd love to hear what you think about, like, my understanding is, like, if you look back in, say, Koryo times, they always talked about, like, Kumgang, the Diamond Mountains, right? This was always a symbol of national pride, right? So, but Dokdo clearly was not, or I mean, I wonder what your perspective on the fight is, because in some ways I can see that this is very much a modern creation, sort of like going back and taking the poet Ulchi and making him a big general, right? I'd love to hear what you think about what a pre-modern historian thinks about these creation of these symbols of Korean unity today, and
yeah, like,
if you don't mind,
like Dokdo.
Yeah?
Okay. Well, Dokdo is an interesting case. First of all, a lot of the historical arguments about Dokdo are based on place names. And pre-modern place names are pretty slippery. They keep changing them. So, you know, you have some scholars in South Korea going back to Silla times and saying, we have this place name that was obviously Dokdo Island, and so Silla was claiming Dokdo Island as part of its territory. Silla really cared about Dokdo Island. You know, I'm pretty skeptical. We get into the 18th century and we find stuff in both Japanese and Korean records about this area. And a lot of it has to do with fishing rights and that kind of stuff. And there were some negotiations, and the Japanese agreed not to come with her. But it really becomes an issue when we get into modern Korea. I think it was, not absolutely sure of the year, but I think it was 1892 or 1893 maybe, when the Korean king, Choson at that time, issued a directive which clearly stated that Dokdo was part of Korean territory. A couple of years after that, the Japanese come along and declared Dokdo to be terra nullius, unoccupied, uncontrolled land. And they claimed it. And they claimed it largely at the behest of the people of Shimane Prefecture, the part of Japan that's closest to Dokdo, an area that was highly dependent on fishing for its living and wanted guaranteed access to the fisheries around there. And so the Japanese subsequently colonized Korea. And so what was the big point? Tokto was part of Japan, just as Korea was. And as I think you know better than I, Dave, the status of Tokto became an issue, or Takeshima became an issue after the end of World War II, 1945, and for complicated reasons, including the fact the US was using it as a bombing range. The status of Tokto was not clarified when the treaty was signed in San Francisco in the early 1950s, ending the war. So South Korean President Syngman simply sent soldiers out there to occupy Tokto and say, this is our land. And that's where we are now. The Japanese keep complaining. And the people in Shimane Prefecture, are the loudest among those who complain. And it's important in Japan because people from Shimane Prefecture have some very powerful native sons in the government in Tokyo. So when Shimane gets exercised about Tokto or Takeshima, then Tokyo gets exercised about Tokyo and Takeshima, or Tokto or Takeshima. But it's a modern issue. I think the Koreans can point to the document which shows King Kojong clearly specifying that Tokto belonged to Ulung Island and is a part of Korean territory as the strongest piece of evidence they've gotten, outside the fact that they have it right now, for their claim over Tokto. As you know, relations between Japan and Korea are vexatious at best, and they've gotten really bad since Abe took over in Tokyo and Park took over in Seoul. And both sides seem to be very happy to use things like Tokto to advance their own political agenda at home, their own domestic political agenda. Both of them are using these as rallying points to divert people's attention away from other issues and get them to line up behind the government. That's my take on it. Yes?
So you mentioned that the myth of ethno-nation, Tanyeminjok, is not so true. And throughout the history, Korea changed a lot of, went through different phases with the different borders and so on and so forth. But the perception of unity seems to have lasted, even though Korea was quite heterogeneous in different ways. Do you think the perception of unity was intentionally crafted in any way to consolidate legitimacy of the power of some sort? Or if so, were there powers who actually kind of participated in crafting of that? Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, let me find the maps. Okay, there you have the maps. You see that in the Koryo period, the Korean state did not exercise control over the northeastern part of the peninsula, right? What we now know as Hamgyong province. Actually, that area was brought under Korean control in the second half of the 14th century, still in Koryo times, largely through the activities of Lee Seung-gae and his father. And Lee Seung-gae was, as you probably know, the founding king of the Choson dynasty. Lee Seung-gae himself grew up in that area, outside of Koryo's borders. Served as an official in a Mongol administration there. He had an uncle who was a Jurchen, and who played a very important role in helping him take over the Korean state and establish the Choson government. And shortly after Lee Seung-gae became king, he sent his uncle, this Jurchen, back up to the northeastern territories, to Hamgyal, or now Hamgyong province, with instructions that said something to the effect that I want you to go up there, I want you to teach our customs and our language to the Jurchens who are living up there, and I want you to encourage them to intermarry with our Korean people. So that suggests a very conscious policy of trying to integrate these people who were of different tribal or ethnic origins than the Koreans into the Korean body politic. Elsewhere, I spent some time looking at early Choson policies towards both the Jurchens up in Manchuria and Japanese. And I concluded that the early Choson government had something that we might typify as an immigration and assimilation policy. Huh? This sounds like 20th century or 21st century America, right? That the Choson government actually made it known that it would give lands and sometimes official titles and tax exemptions to Jurchens or to Wei, Japanese, who came and settled in Korea. And not so many Wei, but some responded to this. A lot of Jurchens did. And this created some problems. One of the problems was that some of the original Choson people would go into districts that were largely inhabited by these Jurchen migrants and pretend to be Jurchens themselves so they wouldn't have to pay taxes. The government didn't like that. And also, some Choson people intermarried with the Jurchens. The government didn't think that was so bad, didn't worry about that, but it was definitely worried about tax evasion. Then there are also a number of entries in the histories which talk about how when these Jurchens came into Choson, they would form these large settlements of their own, and they would maintain Jurchen language and Jurchen customs. And the authorities in Seoul did not like this. They saw this as a threat. And so when these situations were brought to their attention, their response was to order officials to go out there, disperse these communities, move these Jurchens to different locations throughout the country so they will mix with our people and become Omin, or our people. So I think there's clearly a state policy at work there, at times at any rate. I wouldn't say that was a consistent state policy from beginning to end because there's no evidence for that. The other thing I can say is in the Koryo period, the state was very welcoming of migrants from China who had literary skills. People who had been, who could read and write, people who had some knowledge of Confucianism and Buddhism, were welcomed by the Koryo court and usually given homes, given positions in the government. And so government policy certainly had something to do with it. Well, can I add one last comment on my answer to you? You may be wondering why, for example, was the Choson government interested in bringing in Jurchens and Wei, right? Especially when these Jurchens are causing them problems sometimes. I think there are a couple of answers to that question. One is revealed in the very term that the Choson court used for these people. It called them Hyang Hwa In. Hyang means to face. Hwa means transformation. In is people. The fact that these people would come into Choson was seen as ratification, a verification of the notion that Choson was indeed civilized, that the Choson was an advanced country, that Choson rulers were good Confucians. The other more practical reason, in my view, is that in the late 14th and 15th centuries, Choson didn't have enough people. It wanted to have more people to serve in its military, more people to pay its taxes, so it was looking to expand its population by the most expedient means available. Okay?
I was very interested in your discussion of an earlier Korean development of a national identity and a national narrative, and I was wondering how that came into play during Japanese colonization and especially with the wartime mobilization and the implementation of Korean nationals in the Japanese army during World War II, and if you have any, if you've done any research or if you have any just comments about how that played into the building of national narrative and a national legitimacy after World War II.
Yeah, well, obviously, these historical memories that were constructed and reconstructed and maintained by the histories were really important. If you look at the activity of some of the nationalist propagandists of the early 20th century, for example, they go back to these old histories. They dug out this stuff about Ulchimundok, the general who supposedly killed all of these Chinese, and they made him a great national military hero. And said, this guy represents the original Korean spirit. a spirit that has been corrupted by centuries of slavish imitation of the Chinese. We need to go back and recapture that indigenous Korean spirit exemplified by Ulchimundok so that we can defend ourselves against these foreign invaders. So the sense of Koreanness was there, and you had these materials that were reserved in the histories, and you had other oral traditions that had been passed down for centuries about the Hideyoshi invasions of the late 16th century, about the Manchu invasions of the middle of 17th century. All of these things, I think, also were very useful for the nationalists as they were trying to construct a modern Korean nation. How did this relate to Korean experiences under colonial rule? Well, you had these Korean intellectuals, many of them writing outside of Korea, who were continuing this struggle to create a modern nationalism in Korea. But what you could learn inside Korea was, I think, pretty limited. In the 1920s, you probably had some ability to read stuff about Korean history that wasn't completely the sanitized version approved by the government general. But certainly by the time of wartime mobilization in the second half of the 1930s, that stuff was gone. And so you get these young Korean men who joined the Japanese army, volunteered to the Japanese army, and some of them even became kamikaze pilots, and you can find evidence of that at Kagoshima if you go and take a look. Either those guys ever had no exposure to that version of Korean history, to those kinds of historical memories, or else they rejected them in favor of identification with the greater glory of the Japanese Empire. South Korea's famous President Park Chung-hee was a guy who volunteered for the Japanese military. He got went to the Japanese military academy in Guangdong, Manchuria or Dongbei, and then went on for a stint at the regular Japanese military academy in Japan, and became an officer in the Japanese Imperial Army. So there are people who made that choice. What does this mean post-1945? Most of those people who made that choice to identify with Japan during the colonial period spent a lot of time trying to cover that up after 1945. And Park Chung-hee was certainly very good at that. He was president when I was in Korea, both as a soldier in the U.S. Army and as a student at Korea University. Nobody had any idea what he had done during the colonial period, or those who did have an idea kept their mouths shut. And the truth about what he had done didn't come out until the late 1970s, early 1980s, if I remember correctly, after he was dead. So it's a rather complicated situation in South Korea. The people who had been supposedly collaborators with the Japanese continued to be in positions of power, but also continued to disguise or cover up their past. Younger nationalists picked up very much on these earlier narratives that came out in the turn of the 20th century or during the colonial period to try to criticize not only the ways in which Japanese had depicted Korean history, but also they attempted to criticize the South Korean regimes, Syngman-rhee, Park Chung-hee, for their inclusion of significant pro-Japanese elements. And he started getting a rather virulent discourse in Korea about collaborators, colonial period collaborators emerging in the late 1970s and 1980s. And that still remains an issue today. And last summer I was in Seoul. I had lunch with a man who had been one of my professors at Korea University. And his position was very simple. He said that the conservative elements in Korean society today, the people who have money and power, are all people or the descendants of people, the children of people who collaborate with the Japanese. And his position is that South Korea will never have democracy until they purge the country of these pro-Japanese elements. Other people say, whoa, That's a bit of an extreme statement. A lot of the people who were supposedly collaborators with the Japanese were people who had no choice. They collaborated because there was tremendous pressure put on them, or in some cases maybe even guns put to their head. There were also people who cooperated with the Japanese during the colonial period in hopes of improving the lot of their fellow Koreans. So you can't really paint them all the same color. But it remains a very complex and contentious issue in South Korean political and academic life, all the way to today.
About the dispute between the EC and the Sea of Japan, would you say that's an issue of national identity, and what's your opinion on it?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to call it the EC. I have no attachment to the Sea of Japan. Historically, the term Nihonkai or Ilbonhe, or Sea of Japan, simply was not used. It was used until Westerners arrived and decided to slap that name on that particular body of water. Before that, it was known by various other names, including the Eastern Sea. Is it really a question of national identity? I'm not so sure about that as much as Tokto. It's certainly a rallying point. But I think what it really is another understandable, I think, expression of resistance to what imperialism did to countries like Korea. So, in other words, during the high age of imperialism, who's going to get the name for the body of water? It's not going to be the weaker, smaller country like Korea. It's going to be the powerful country like Japan. And so the retention of this kind of name, which was a new name, I think comes across to many Koreans as saying that we still have not overcome all of the vestiges of high imperialism. And so I think that's what that issue is really about. I might be wrong, but that's the way I see it.
Well, thanks, John. Join me, everybody, in thanking.
Thank you. My pleasure.